Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. We are very happy to be back with you again. The Geneva Environment Network has the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for an event convened by Switzerland within the framework of the network that will address equity considerations in nationally determined contributions. For those who don't know our platform, we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. As you all know, 2020 remains a milestone for and the parties to the Paris Agreement are due to submit to the UN Climate Change Convention Secretariat their national determined contributions by the end of the year. Due to the current pandemic, most negotiations that were due to take place this year have been postponed to next year and to the following. However, important discussions have been taking place to raise the necessity for more and better climate. And some of our panelists might have been involved in those discussions in the last weeks and days. This Saturday, the virtual Climate Ambition Summit, co-hosted by the United Nations, the United Kingdom and France, in partnership with Chile and Italy, will mark the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement. Various countries in the past weeks and days have been announcing the new tenure of their NDCs. And it is in this context that this event is taking place, looking at equity and fairness considerations in these submissions as they are due to take place by the end of the year. I have the pleasure to introduce you to our guest today. We have with us to welcome you Ambassador Franz Perez, the Ambassador for the Environment of Switzerland. He will also introduce you to the topic of the event today. We have also with us a series of guests that are well known for their work on equity in general. We have with us Professor Henri Chou, who is a Professor Emeritus of Politics and International Relations at the Merton College of Oxford University, and who will be delivering the first presentation. This first presentation will be commented by Anya Carnain, who is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Binghamton University in New York. We have also with us Professor Lucas Meyer, who is a Professor of Philosophy in the Moral and Political Philosophy section of the University of Graz. His presentation will be commented by Andreas Bachmann, who advises on ethical issues at the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. And we also have with us various commentators that have been invited to add some reflections to what will be said. Among those, we have Ana Patricia Villalobos, who is the head of the Costa Rica delegation to the UN Climate Change Conference negotiations. We have also with us Her Excellency Ambassador Janine Fel of Belize to the United Nations and the Deputy Chairperson of the Alliance of Small Island States. We have also with us Harald Winkler, Professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. From Geneva, we have Vincente Yu, who is an independent consultant and an expert on the UN Convention on Climate Change, and who was also previously with the South Center in Geneva. Finally, the last commentator, also from Geneva, Sébastien Duc, who is a senior attorney focusing on climate and energy at the Center for International Environmental Law. It is now my pleasure to turn to His Excellency Ambassador Franz Perez, who will welcome you and introduce you to the topic that we will be discussing today. Franz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. Dear Diana, dear participants and colleagues, let me first thank you, Diana, and UNEP's Geneva Environment Network for organizing this event on equity consideration in nationally determined contributions, NDC. GEN was initially launched as an initiative to bring together the members of the network, of the Environment Network in Geneva, and to foster the different actors to interact together and to exchange together and to make best of the place of Geneva. However, this year, as GEN had to organize its events due to Corona virtually, its outreach has broadened tremendously. And UNEP was able, through these thematic Gen events, to engage interested persons from all around the world to engage on topics that are relevant on our international agenda. Despite the fact that I would not miss the physical exchange and meetings in Geneva organized by the Gen, I think also this broader outreach, this broader impact is certainly something very positive. So let me thank you, Diana, not only for organizing today's event and bringing us here together, but also for making sure that through Gen, we have this marvelous platform for exchange, which now has become a global platform. Today, Gen is convening a group of eminent persons from academy and from climate change negotiations to discuss a topic that both is highly relevant from environmental policy real life, but at the same time also very interesting and stimulating from a theoretical perspective. Equity considerations in nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. The relationship between equity and fairness and climate change is stimulating a lot of thinking. It often provokes emotional interventions, and it also leads sometimes to value judgments which may be more ideological and simplistic than the reflection of thorough analysis of facts, objective criteria, and possibilities. Thereby, it is often forgotten that equity and fairness is more than a value judgment. If equity and fairness discussions would only reflect different subjective values and ideologies, then a real interaction would not be possible. Equity and fairness have to build on common denominators that are as an objective and rational, on common denominators that are as objective and as rationally defendable as possible to allow a discussion between each other and to develop together joint perspectives and views. Today's event will go beyond ideology and simplistic thinking. I'm really proud that such eminent persons have agreed to join us here and that in this virtual event and to share with us their thought, analysis and reflection on what fairness and equity could mean in the context of the obligations under the Climate Change Agreement of Paris. But before handing over to the speakers, let me briefly recall the purpose of equity considerations in the NDCs. The first step, I think, was a decision to develop an international instrument on climate change that should be applicable to all, meaning engaging all. That decision was taken in Durban, and that agreement was then adopted in 2015 in Paris. This decision triggered two fundamental questions. How can we, on the one side, ensure that each country is engaged and is undertaking what is needed to effectively address the threat of climate change? This is an objective perspective, what is needed to address the risks and challenge of climate change. But on the other side, it also triggered the question, how can we reflect the differences between the countries? The differences, for example, between big emitters such as China and the US and small emitters such as US, Switzerland and Tuvalu, or the difference between countries with high capacity, such as Korea and Saudi Arabia, or countries with limited capacities, such as Gambia and Bhutan. This tension between, on the one side, the top-down need for maximal efforts by each country, and on the other side, the need to reflect the fundamentally different circumstances of the different countries, led to the hybrid approach of the Paris Agreement of bounded flexibility. On the one side, there's a bottom-up approach through the fact that countries can determine nationally their contribution to the common objective. On the other side, there are top-down elements to pull and push factors, guiding and limiting the space of national determination. Thus, on the one side, each country has to determine itself how it contributes to the common objectives and needs. And while each country has an obligation to submit such a contribution, it has itself to define its emission reduction target. Or in the language of the Paris Agreement, the contribution of each country is nationally determined, it's NDC. On the other side, These NDCs have to reflect the country's highest ambition. That's also enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Each country has to provide, when submitting the NDC, information necessary for the clarity, transparency, and understanding of this NDC. And this includes information on how its NDC contributes to the mitigation objective of the Paris Agreement and of UNFCCC, how the NDC reflects its highest ambition, how a party considers that its NDC is fair and ambitious in the light of its national circumstances, and information on its fairness consideration reflecting equity. In a nutshell, the obligation to provide information about how a party considers its NDC fair and equitable was conceived as a pull and push factor, motivating and stimulating parties to formulate ambitious NDCs. By being obliged to explain how it considers its NDC as adequate, fair, and equitable, a party should be forced to reflect seriously what would be adequate in the light of its specific circumstances. And it would also be motivated at the same time to formulate targets that indeed do reflect their highest possible ambition. Switzerland has taken that obligation of submitting NDC seriously, and has also taken that obligation to consider equity and fairness seriously, because we have understood that as a critical element in a delicate balance of the Paris Agreement between the potential, with the potential to bring the international community through increasingly ambitious NDC step by step on a 1.5-degree pathway. Therefore, Switzerland has organized already several times, including also at COPs, side events to discuss and deepen our understanding what this ethical consideration, equity consideration could mean exactly. And we are looking forward to organize again such an event at the next COP in Glasgow. In order to be able to appreciate these NDCs, it is helpful to have robust criteria for their equity considerations. Equity should not be seen as something subjective purely. It should not be something as just reflecting different values, different truths, or different realities. It should provide us with a language to really appreciate, based on as objective criteria, as on indicators on which we agree upon, how ambitious our individual efforts are, of course, always in the context of the specific national circumstances. I think this is now definitely the moment to hand over to you and to the presentators so that they can share their reflections on equity considerations in NDCs. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a stimulating and rich presentation and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franz, for introducing to the topic we're discussing to us. And indeed, we are now moving to our first eminent guest, Professor Henry Xu, who will focus his presentation on the pivotal generation. Professor Xu, the floor is yours.
I'm delighted to be able to be with you. Sure, our current situation is that we've so far failed to place any outer limit on the severity of climate change, either its physical manifestations or its socio-political effects. For now, physical climate change can simply worsen indefinitely. If certain tasks must be done sooner or later, and if we complete fewer of them, other people in the future will need to do more. But climate change is not so benign. It's not merely that we may leave work against the dangers unfinished. The dangers are multiplying thanks to our continuing profligate combustion of fossil fuel. If we do less to control climate change now, the worst in future will not only be worse than it otherwise would have been, but, as of now, worse without constraint. Specifically, until CO2 emissions reach net zero, there will be no limit on how severe climate change must become. It seems intolerable that we should acquiesce in contributing to a potential runaway global danger. The most elementary advice given to someone who planned to visit a gambling casino in the days before ubiquitous credit cards and phone banking was, decide while you're still at home how much is the maximum amount you could afford to lose and take only that much with you. In other words, put a firm limit on maximum losses in the face of uncertainty. Those who opt for less ambitious NDCs than are readily possible are ignoring this basic advice with regard to the well-being of future generations. They are leaving the door through which dangers of unknown magnitude for future generations can enter open for longer than it would need to remain open. They are leaving potential absolute losses for people in the future unbounded. It's well established that as long as the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, and especially CO2, continues to expand, climate change will continue to become more severe. And as long as CO2 is emitted in amounts that produce net additions to the atmospheric concentration, that concentration will, of course, continue to expand. Accordingly, until global carbon emissions reach net zero, no outer limit on the maximum severity of climate change has been set. The severity of climate change can worsen indefinitely until carbon emissions reach zero. Decarbonization must be thorough and prompt in order to cap the atmospheric concentration, which requires vastly more ambitious NDCs than nations are currently committed. The less ambitious mitigation is, the later the date that the atmospheric accumulation will stabilize, and the longer the climate change remains unbounded, and the costs of the gamble inflicted upon future generations has no upper limit. To impose this limitless gamble would be outrageously unfair to individuals in future generations. A climate that's worsening indefinitely leaves all bad options open. We have inadvertently opened the barn door, and some of the horses have bolted, but other valuable horses, for reasons of their own, have lingered in the barn. For now, nothing's stopping them from leaving too. So it's time to relock the barn door securely and save all that can still be saved. It would be reprehensible to take no action even if indefinitely worsening climate change were a purely natural phenomenon. Since we are in fact driving climate change with our own greenhouse gas emissions, especially our carbon emissions, it is obviously all the more our responsibility, a negative one, simply not to wreak havoc. We confront a spectacular opportunity. We are the first generation with access to climate science that tells us what to do to set a limit on climate change, namely, choosing NDCs sufficiently ambitious to establish an early date for net zero carbon. We, our generation, may be able to set a floor under the worst that can happen to future generations. This would be an invaluable moral achievement that would reverberate across millennia. We may also be the last generation capable of limiting the extent of climate change. The dynamics of the climate system are not linear. Instead, they contain numerous tipping points at which change can abruptly speed up or become more severe. In important cases, this non-linear change constitutes a positive feedback in which one form of worsening feeds other forms of worsening. And some of these positive feedbacks are irreversible. For example, the now irreversible melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. The longer we delay the date of arrival at net zero carbon emissions because of less ambitious NDCs, the more we risk allowing a cascade of positive feedbacks to become entrenched, perhaps accelerating in ways that humans eventually could not control. These tipping points are significant because they unleash either or both of two conceptually separate but often empirically inseparable processes. Passing a tipping point means triggering irreversible change, and frequently these irreversible changes themselves also become long-term positive feedbacks. Conceptually, a change as being irreversible and a change as being a positive feedback are two different matters, but these two features are often found together. Although we're discussing climate change that's anthropogenic, it's important to keep in mind that whenever human action sets off positive feedbacks, what was originally anthropogenic takes on a life of its own. Andreas Malm characterizes this nicely, quoting him, "Society having touched off climate change, nature does the rest of the work. Global warming is not built, but triggered," end quote. We're confronting climate change that's initiated by humans, but this increasingly includes the positive feedbacks produced by the already operative climate dynamics into which we are recklessly intruding. It's already worrying that we have so far imposed no limit on the disruption that we're causing to the climate. But that could have meant only that we were very slowly and incrementally making matters worse for a while. If we leave the disruption unlimited for long enough, that we meanwhile pass critical tipping points, like initiating irreversible melting of additional ice sheets, then the most limited that climate damage can possibly ever be will be worse than otherwise. The other side of the coin, of course, is that if we throw ourselves into implementing ambitious NDCs, we can make a huge positive difference for the lives of virtually every person who will live in the future on this planet.
Java.
Professor Xu, I think you have concluded here what you wanted to say, correct?
Yes.
So we're now turning to Professor Anja Karnijn, who will be commenting on what you have presented. So Professor Karnijn, the floor is yours, and you will be also sharing some slides.
So I can't, oh yes, I can share now. Thank you. Thank you, Henry, for a very, very powerful reminder of what is at stake. I want to, just a moment, I would like to use my comment, spell out or to basically highlight some of Henry's key points and to spell out at least one implication for fairness and equity. So how do I move on here? Okay, here. So there are two different contexts in which we might think, about equity and fairness concerns. So one is an intergenerational context, the context between different generations. And here Henry uses a concept of generation of the overlapping kinds. So there are different ways in which people speak about generations. But Henry talks about generations and distinguishes intergenerations by those who do not overlap with each other. So everybody currently living, no matter whether they're old or young, belong to the current generation, and everybody who hasn't been born yet during our lifetimes is a future generation. So there are equity and fairness concerns between the current generation and generations to come. But there is another context for equity and fairness concerns, and that context is intragenerational. That is the question of how to distribute burdens within any given generation. So Henry's comments focus a lot on the intergenerational aspect here. So he says, he very powerfully says that equity and fairness considerations between generations unequivocally demand action now and aggressive action now. So he says, I'm taking this from a handout I saw previously for the talk now. So easing our burdens by making theirs heavier is unfair, especially since future generations are entirely at our mercy. He had several more things to say in this regard, but regarding how unfair it would be for now, the pivotal generation, not to take aggressive action. The intragenerational context, when we ask about equity and fairness concerns within a generation, is also what's on many people's minds, especially in the context of the NDCs. So Switzerland, in point 6 of its intended nationally determined contributions, starts by saying, he shares the required efforts to combat global climate change in a fair and equitable manner. It then goes on to spell out what it would mean to be fair and equitable, and this has to do with the country's responsibility for contributing to CO2 emissions and with a country's capacities to goes on to say Switzerland is committed to continue contributing its fair share in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which I take to mean, so the emphasis here, I read this wrong, contribute its fair share in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That could be taken to suggest that Switzerland is committed to doing its fair share, but also no more. But the question, of course, is, given that there's so much non-compliance in the world, and one doesn't know what the others are doing, whether they're pulling their weight, what if more were required given the non-compliance of others? What if combating climate change required having to shoulder a significantly unfair burden compared to others? Because others aren't doing their fair share. Others might not be as ambitious or not fulfill their ambitions to the same extent that another country may. So Henry's comment have a strong suggestion with regard to this question. His suggestion is that, and I'm just paraphrasing what he said so much more eloquently a moment ago, but so he's saying that given the enormous risk to future generations that runaway climate change poses, and the possibly unique chance the current generation, the pivotal generation as he calls us, has to mitigate this risk. Maybe future generations won't have the chance anymore. Fairness and equity concerns between contemporaries, as important as they might be, and now I'm putting words in Henry's mouth. He didn't say it this way, and he might object. But this is how I'm interpreting it: is that these equity concerns and fairness concerns between contemporaries have to take a back seat. They have to be await or be addressed in a different forum, because what's at stake is just too important for those concerns to take precedent. So in other words, we should not, intergenerational equity and fairness considerations should limit each country's contributions, right? Or what they entitle a country not to do, because the country might say, well, if nobody else is pulling their weight and doing their fair share, maybe we shouldn't do this either, or maybe we should do our fair share, but really nothing more. So rather we should ask, how much a country ought to contribute given the intergenerational problem at hand, the one between the generations, between us and future generations. Given the hugeness of the problem at hand, climate change, one's ability to help, the capacity consideration, and the extent to which others are in fact contributing, meaning that if very few others are contributing, the problem remains larger. And if one is able to help more, this would suggest that one would have to help more and do more than one's fair share even if that would be very, very unfair. So, and then one would say, but it would be so unfair. So that can't just be left hanging. So the answer to that would have to be that any inequity and unfairness that might result from one's fulfilling one's that may result from fulfilling one's intergenerational responsibility would have to be addressed separately in a different context. So I have a question I'm going to ask now, which is a pragmatic question. I just want to say this might seem preposterous, a suggestion, because fairness considerations are very powerful for people, and they're moved by it, and it's going to be difficult to convince people to say, well, even if it's unfair, you might have, given the gravity of the problem. So I wanted to suggest a context outside the climate change context, where this doesn't sound like a preposterous consideration and where people would naturally come to this conclusion. So consider the situation of parents and their children. Two responsible for children, and the fair way to distribute responsibilities would have one parent for the child half the week, and the other parent be responsible for the parent on the second half of the week. And now suppose that one parent just decides not to contribute, not to do their fair share. And then the question is, well, is now the answer that the other parent just does their fair share, just feeds and cares for the child for half the week? And obviously here, in that context, one would say that would be a preposterous proposal, right? We would say, obviously, the parent that's there has to feed the child for the entire week, even if the other parent is a slacker. I'd also say that the unfairness that arises in this context would have to be addressed separately in a different context. Maybe the partnership between the parents should be dissolved. Maybe there should be some compensation. Maybe other things should occur. But of course, the child needs to be fed, or the children need to be fed and cared for the entire week, and nobody would question that. So I'm just saying that is a different context in which this logic would clearly apply. So that just leads to a question I have, not so much for Henry, it's a practical question that might be on your minds, and that would be for policymakers to answer, namely what this might mean for less powerful states willing to take on more for their burdens, given what I just said. So how should they approach the more powerful non-compliers? And that would be, again, a practical issue, a different issue from the one that I've been raising now, which is how to think about equity and fairness and its place in these different contexts. But this would be the practical question that would have to be addressed. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Karnine. Professor Shu, anything you would like to add to what Professor Karnine just said? Before we move to the next presentation? We can hear you. Please go ahead.
I would simply agree with her elaboration of what I said. I think that this generation right now represents an absolutely unique opportunity to set the trajectory of climate change so that the severity is as little as it can still be at this time. Vital that we exploit this opportunity. If this means that some of us do more than it might have been fair for us to do, Perhaps we can get compensated some other way, exactly as Anya said. But it's I think her analogy of the parents is exactly right. If one parent said, well, I'm not going to do my half of the work, it would be absurd for the other to say, well, I'm still going to do only my half. That's work that must get done, and the unfairness will have to get sorted out some other way some other time.
Thank you very much, Professor Xu. I think we can move now for the next presentation. We will take questions and answers at the end of this session. So it's now my pleasure to turn to another eminent guest, as Franz referred to them. Professor Lucas Meyer, the floor is yours, and you have also some slides so that we will be able to share very soon.
Okay, thank you. I will present on fairness critically conditions the carbon budget allocation across countries. This is based on a study that I did with two economists and a climate physicist of the University of Graz.
Can you just adjust the micro in front of, just adjust the mic. Yeah, you had asked me to.
Sorry. So these colleagues are Keith Williges, Karl Steininger, and Gottfried Kirchengast. And we built on an explication of climate justice and assessed how a carbon budget complying with the climate goals of the Paris Agreement could be distributed, and then show the implications that justice considerations have. For that, we need to establish an estimate for the remaining global carbon budget. As you know, there are a good number of such estimates that have been worked out. In the study, we rely on the ones that you see on the bottom, and for the numbers that I will present, it's the well below 2 degrees Celsius estimate, which is in accordance with Paris Agreement Article 2. Then we distribute the budget. That means the 700 global carbon budget left, gigatons global carbon budget left for the period 2017 to 2050. Based on two main burden sharing mechanisms and 3 qualifications that address the shortcomings of both these burden sharing mechanisms. The burden sharing mechanisms are contractual. Those are the most discussed ones in the literature, and I take it also the most influential ones in the international negotiations. According to contraction and convergence, every country begins with their current per person emissions, and the countries then converge on a common future level of emissions by 2050, namely net zero. Historical emissions are disregarded. Contraction and convergence implies a strong form of grandfathering, and it is interesting that countries don't explicitly argue for some. Countries can be shown to effectively base their pledges on such a notion of grandfathering. I will show you some numbers on that in a second. And contraction and convergence, of course, implies that highly industrialized countries will have more emission rights in the transition phase to a low carbon society than they would have under equal per capita. Per capita has the starting assumption that all countries are allocated an equal amount of emissions per person from now on and for the time horizon up to 2000. Disregarded. However, given that starting from today, all countries are allocated an equal amount of emissions per person, equal per capita does not imply grandfathering. The Paris NDCs can be shown to effectively be based on grandfathering, as I said before. The difference between the NDCs and the pledges that the countries would need to make under EPC increases as countries' past emissions per person increase. Higher past emitters rely more heavily on grandfathering. the NDC 2015 emissions per person on average, and on the y-axis the difference between what you would expect if countries would rely on claim grandfathering and their committed budgets in percentages. So the higher the emissions of the country, the greater the difference between the expected and committed budgets, and it goes very high up. Now, we qualify these approaches to take into account minimal principles, namely 4, securing basic needs, attributing historical responsibility for historical benefits from past emissions, and then there is also the consideration that one should not impose reduction that is infeasible. So let me introduce these qualifications. The first qualification is the needs qualification, the N qualification. It asserts that all people should be allocated emissions which can allow them to reach at least a certain level of well-being, namely the level of well-being that is required for them. Can compare emissions in the past with indicators of well-being. For that we use the Human Development Index, and then you find a relationship between increasing emissions and increasing HDI that allows you to define an average level of emissions for a given level of HDI and for that is required by basic needs. So when a country's per person emissions are below a threshold that is required for that, then they are allocated an initial level of and then the remaining emissions are allocated via contraction, convergence, or equal per capita. Two next qualifications concern historical emission. Address the issue that both of these approaches in their simple form, contraction and convergence and equal per capita, fail to take into account emissions prior to today, but that on the other hand, we know that countries should be responsible for emissions they have caused in the past. Now we set the date from which on they should be taken to be responsible very late, namely 1995, and then to operationalize this idea, we simply move the year of accounting back to 1995, which since 1995 count towards their budgets. However, emissions prior to 1995 are still unaccounted for. Second emission qualifications addresses that. So emissions from before 1995 can be taken into account as long-term consequences of their use in contributing to the benefits that currently living people have now and will in the future. For that, as 1995, and we added it to the initial carbon budget. And this larger budget then is distributed to countries minus their individual embodied emissions. That means that we equalize from historical emissions. That reflects an idea that the for countries should be distributed equally or fairly. Now, as I said, the capital approach, different from the contraction and convergence approach, does not imply grandfathering. However, there might be arguments for grandfathering, and 2 points in particular speak in favor, or supposedly speak in favor, of some form of limited grandfathering. The first one is that quickly reducing emissions from a high to a very low level of emissions is more costly in terms of costs of adaptation, substitution, or giving up of certain goals, and leads to the frustration of legitimate expectations. In the end, we reject that argument, and mainly on the basis of 2 considerations. First, the reduction costs may be less burdensome than the high damages and adaptation costs faced by low emitters. And second, even if costs are higher for high emitters, compensation or adaptation assistance should fall on states that play a constitutive role in forming these expectations, rather than affect the distribution of the global carbon budget. In other words, on the basis of this idea, you should not allocate a greater share of the global carbon budget to high emitting countries. Is that of economic, technological, institutional, social, cultural, or other dimensions. This is an argument for a limit to be placed on the burden faced by individual countries in terms of reduction rates. There's little research as far as that reduction rates up to be deemed feasible. This is definitely an average for this confirmation period, 7%. And we assume this to be the maximum yearly reduction. Given this limit, we calculate the minimum possible cumulative budget a country would need to have. Then we compare that limit to the budget allocation that a country would get under the simple equal per capita approach. So if EPC is found wanting, if the equal per capita approach would allocate less to a country, then countries are pre-allocated the difference between this minimum possible cumulative budget and their EPC simple allocation. Then again, the distribution of the remaining budget for and the benefits from historical emissions qualification.
Professor Meyer, before you move to the next slide, may I ask you to stop your video because there's some problems with the sound and that might help with who is trying to listen. It's just at the bottom, just clicking on stop video at the bottom. I cannot do it for you. At the bottom, stop video. That would help maybe with the sound. Down of your screen. Just continue if you don't find it, so that we don't lose time.
Okay,
no problem. Please continue.
All right.
Because you are presenting, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we come now to fairness considerations imply in terms of the allocation of the global carbon budget. This budget exhaustion if countries would maintain their 2016 level of emissions. The blue shades indicate budget exhaustion in the future. White indicate they have just used up their budgets in 2016, and orange shades indicate countries which would have already exhausted their budget under such an allocation. Now, on the left, you the right hand for conversion, and in the first row, simple versions of equal per capita and contraction and convergence, and then in the second row, at once taking into account the qualification used, the needs, the historical emissions, and the benefits from historical emissions qualifications. And then finally, E is the EPC is the EPC approach qualified also by this constraint of not. Now, what is interesting, I find, is that when you compare A and D, they are very similar. So the implications of a qualified contraction and convergence approach, qualified by these three qualifications, are similar to the implications of a simple equal per capita approach. That can be explained in the following way. When you qualify contraction or convergence by HDI, by an HDI threshold, by the needs qualification, this leads to countries being granted a budget close to the simple EPC budget. And secondly, past emissions are so high that taking them into account practically eliminates the difference between contraction and convergence in simple equal per capita for below HDI countries, and most of the difference for the historically high emitting countries. A second way to depict our findings is this. So this figure shows the per person budgets available given the various ways to distribute the remaining global carbon budget. So here, what you find is that we distinguish the differences that each qualification makes, and then what these qualifications make together. So first, always the simple approach, and then it's introduced the needs qualification, then the approach when qualified by the first of the historical emissions qualifications and the second. And then the fourth one here is the three qualifications taken together. And of course, for equal per capita, then you need also to have an extra one that shows what the introduction of the constraint, what difference the introduction of the constraint makes. So for each country here, you have these findings, right? And what you can see, I think, is that there are stark differences in the consequences of a contraction and convergence approach and an EPC approach between developing and industrialized countries, but that there are also large variation owing to these qualifying criteria. For instance, when you compare Germany, United States, or when you compare India and China, and I will show you one more. So the considerations of historic emissions, the age qualification, this is the third bar, changes budgets most dramatically for most countries. One exception is Germany under the contraction and convergence approach. There, the B qualification makes a bigger difference. And the considerations of historic emissions do more to make a difference more so than adjusting for the ability to reach the HDI threshold, the N qualification. That's true for most countries. For many countries, the three qualifications N, H, and B under the equal per capita approach generally affect budgets to a smaller degree than under the contraction and convergence approach, but that's not true for the GA countries. So I come to my conclusions. Major fairness concerns are critical in determining how to allocate the remaining global carbon budget, and more so than the choice between broad allocations such as contraction and convergence or equal per capita. That is what the first way of depicting the results showed when you compared A and D. Only if we fulfill major and minimal fairness requirements can we specify a plausible understanding of allocating the global carbon budget across countries for the period of transformation to a low carbon economy and society. These requirements include securing basic needs, attributing historical responsibility for historical emissions, accounting for benefits from past emissions, and not exceeding feasible reduction rates. Addressing minimal fairness requirements leads to a distribution which is at least equal to the implications of an EPC of an equal per capita simple mechanism. The critical interpretation of these fairness concerns allow us to identify a fourfold qualified equal per capita approach as the most plausible approach. By taking into account the legitimate reasons for grandfathering, the thus qualified equal per capita approach can be understood to reflect what is defensible in the rationale for grandfathering of the contraction and convergence approach. Such an EPC approach with all four qualifications is a promising proposal for reaching international agreement on the allocation of the remaining global carbon budget.
Thank you very much, Professor Meyer. I have now the pleasure to turn to Andreas from the Federal Office for the Environment to comment on your presentation. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to try to make it as short as possible, but that's quite a challenge because Lucas Meyer's insightful and challenging presentation cannot be adequately appreciated in just 5 minutes. I therefore have to concentrate on a few aspects regarding mainly the normative role of equal per capita and contraction and convergence. Now let's suppose a global greenhouse gas budget concerning the 1.5-degree aim can be defined. The question is, how should this budget be distributed fairly among the individual countries? Now here I agree with Lucas Meyer in one fundamental respect. There is a moral claim that certain goods are guaranteed. Meyer calls them basic needs, and he links them to a sufficiency threshold. I call them basic rights. For reasons that I cannot explain here, I do not consider the concept of basic needs plausible in this context. But independently of this, it is about the right of all people to have those goods without which a decent life is not possible. And in my opinion, these include not only material goods, but also things such as self-determination or free exercise of religion. Now, the implementation of these rights, or in Meyer's terms, ensuring that the basic needs are met, is linked to activities that are associated with CO2 emissions. The ethically crucial point is that all people, every and each individual, wherever and whenever they live, have the same justified moral claim to have their basic rights guaranteed, and thus also to the emissions that are necessary for this. However, this does not lead to equality of emissions per capita, because after all, achieving a decent standard of living depends on geographical circumstances, on cultural and individual particularities that must be taken into account. So this is a reason why the equal per capita approach as such is implausible from my point of view. And if I understand him correctly, Lucas Meyer agrees. This means that these emissions would have to be kind of deducted or subtracted from the global greenhouse gas budget. However, I think with one restriction, which is particularly important with regard to those countries where many people have not yet reached this minimum standard. These people have the right to live a life, to live such a life, but they, or rather those in positions of political responsibility, must ensure that emissions remain as low as possible. In particular, it should be avoided that this development is based on fossil energy and fossil infrastructure. Now, starting from this normative idea, the first step would be to determine how much of the remaining global budget would be consumed if such a decent standard of living were to be realized globally, because everyone has a right to such a standard. Now, there are two options. It may be that the whole budget would be consumed, nothing remains, so there would be nothing left to distribute. And this would mean that those emissions that exceed this minimum, let's call them luxury emissions after Henry Schu's term, they would have to be reduced to zero. This reduction would have to occur at the same rate as emissions increase in the area of basic needs or basic rights. If, on the other hand, a positive global budget remains after deduction of the global basic needs or basic rights emissions, the question arises as to how it should be distributed. In this respect, I believe that neither equal per capita nor contraction and convergence are ethically plausible criteria. However, they are qualified. And the reason for this is simple. Unlike basic needs or basic rights emissions, I think there's no moral claim to luxury emissions or to a certain share of these emissions. There is no material criterion, such as equal per capita, that could decide how they are to be distributed fairly. That is because no one has a positive right to a certain defined amount. Yeah. It is clear, however, that if these emissions are not reduced, the remaining global budget will be exhausted in a short time, And the question is therefore not primarily who is entitled to how many of these emissions. The question is rather who has to reduce how much. And my general thesis here is that, of course, contraction as a kind of reduction is obviously necessary, but not with the aim of convergence or an equal per capita distribution. Let us assume that we continue to emit CO2 and do not take any further measures than those already taken. In this scenario, we can indicate by how much we will exceed the remaining global budget from now, say, until 2050. This means that we can determine a negative global budget that is, we can say how much we have to reduce by 2050 in order not to exceed the remaining budget. Then the question is which country has to reduce how much. In this regard, my proposal is a little bit different from Lucas Meyer's proposal. My proposal would be to decide this issue on the basis of the polluter pays principle. However, this principle is not understood here as a historical backward-looking principle, but as a kind of future-oriented prospective principle. Each country is responsible for future emissions that it will cause, and therefore also for those that it must not cause, that it must avoid in order to meet the reduction target. In other words, we take each country's share of global emissions in a reference year, for example, 2020, and extend it into the future until 2050. That is, we make an assumption as to how much a country will emit if no further measures are taken. Assume that Switzerland, for example, is responsible for about 0.1% of total emissions, of these total emissions. This would mean that it would have to assume 0.1% of the global budget to be reduced. Of course, if the share in emissions changes over time, appropriate adjustments would have to be made. This implies, of course, that there are countries that have to reduce much more than others in percentage and in absolute terms. If this reduction has to take place within a certain time frame, because otherwise the morally binding target will not be met, I find it difficult to argue that there is such a thing as was what Lucas Meyer calls an overly burdensome reduction in normative terms. For moral obligations can only be justified if they can be fulfilled. However, if they can be fulfilled, they must be fulfilled, however it costs. That is part and parcel of what a moral duty is. This follows from the widely accepted rule that ought, the moral ought implies can. So I think we have to be very careful with this feasibility constraint, this notion of a feasibility constraint. That's a very tricky and even dangerous concept, in my opinion. In my argumentation, past emissions play no role. However, it is important to note that this only applies to mitigation, that is the reduction of CO2 emissions. The situation is different in the area of adaptation. Countries bear responsibility for past emissions to the extent that they should have known of their harmfulness. This responsibility is measured again by the polluter pays principle, but now in a historical sense, that is by the extent to which damage that has already occurred and damage that has not yet occurred but will certainly occur, that is cannot be prevented, can be attributed to them and their past emissions. For those earlier emissions for which nobody is responsible, in my opinion, the ability to pay principle would have to be applied. By contrast, and again, this may be different to what Lucas Meyer thinks correct, the beneficiary pays principle is not plausible for reasons that I cannot go into here. To conclude, it remains the case that at the end of this process, that is when the global greenhouse gas budget has been used up, only that amount of CO2 emissions is allowed that can be compensated by natural or artificial sinks. That means net zero. Thanks.
Thank you, Andreas. It's now time to turn our conversation We have with us various climate change negotiators and representatives from civil society. Let us start with Ana Patricia Villalobos, who is the head of delegation of Costa Rica to the climate change negotiations. Ana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in such an interesting event. When we talk about fairness and equity, of course, we go back to the bottom-up approach of the Paris Agreement, because it basically touches upon the responsibilities that every country in its national determination can identify, and of course can identify also the way that it tackles the share that it has to address regarding carbon budget. There is not, I would say, unique interpretation of how it should be implemented practically, and we've seen this through the presentations that we have heard. There's of course common understanding that developed countries should bear the heaviest burden, but they also have a limited mitigation opportunities, I think, and while developing countries that should probably have fewer obligations in tackling the climate change do present greater opportunities of emission reductions. This bottom-up architecture, national circumstances have become, as I read somewhere, the watchwords of fairness and ambition. When we discuss these issues in the Paris Agreement, we do not discuss them and we do not go into depth into the national determined contributions by their content, but rather we go and we address them by the process that we have to follow in order to get our NDCs. This is the approach that we decided then. So of course the question remains on how will fairness and equity be ensured in a world of voluntary climate contributions. I like the premise that I read somewhere from Professor Xu, that we cannot choose the challenges that we face, but we can indeed choose the way that we respond to those challenges. And this is basically what I wanted to touch upon, because I'm one of those eternal optimists. I think that we as countries can do so much in tackling not only our fair share, and I'm taking the words of Professor Carmine here, but also going a little bit further. And that does not imply that we are necessarily taking upon the obligation of other countries, but rather that we're doing what we need to do, because we know for a fact that even though the determinations are national, have a national context to them, indeed the result, the impact is a global one, and we cannot deny that. We are in a context nowadays in which we have to present the updated of our NDCs. And of course, we have the pandemic. And what the pandemic has showed us, if we were not aware of that before, is that we're very fragile, very vulnerable, and very dependent. We are trying to look for responses that are applicable in a very short term, because countries, of course, nowadays are faced with a lot of challenges regarding their economic, their health, their future in general terms. So, of course, we want to apply short-term responses now because we need them now. But we have to make sure that those responses do incorporate notions of climate change in the longer, in the long terms. We need to invest and we need to plan for a future that looks more uncertain now than ever. We have to, of course, step away from this model of development that we have so far put into implementation, which, of course, departs from a very linear way of doing things by extracting, utilizing, and then just throwing away. And we need to go back and think about the way that we're doing things and go to a more circular way of developing our countries. Of course, that touches upon establishing goals, national goals, as we've done, like in the case of Costa Rica, our decarbonization plan. We have a very, very ambitious goal. And of course, the ambitious, and France touched upon this at the beginning of the event, it's a tricky word because, of course, we can always be ambitious, but with a limit to that ambition regarding the fair share that we think is the one that we have to address. But of course, again, being an optimistic and always hoping for the better and thinking that we can do a lot of good things, then of course the option is to be ambitious as much as we can do, way even beyond what we're supposed to do. In that construction of a new paradigm, in that construction of a new model of development, of course, we have to include all sectors, but not necessarily sectors in terms of economic sectors or physical sectors, but also including people, groups of people that might not be as well represented in those sectors. And this is something that we have to incorporate in the developing or our NDC. We've learned this the hard way. In Costa Rica, our first INDC was based basically upon the past emissions. And we departed from that and projected a way forward in order to try to better what we needed to do and to, again, tackle the compromise that we had to face. But that's not necessarily a good way of doing, because at the end you might end up with something that sounds good, looks good in paper, and of course looks good if you bring it to the table, mostly if you do it in the negotiation table, but it might not be feasible and it might not be something that you can implement, basically because you have lost a good part of what an NDC should contain, which is, of course, the qualitative part of things. We have to, of course, and as I repeat this, think globally, act nationally, and in a very individual way also. For this NDC and in tackling fairness and share and understanding that, again, we can depart from what we need to do, but we can also be aware of the fact that we can do way much more. Then in Costa Rica's case, in tackling our NDC, we basically went back again to what we did in our first NDC. And then we looked into the processes that we had followed, mostly in defining our adaptation policy, for instance. In that exercise, we incorporated the opinions, the comments, the suggestions of a lot of different groups. And we understood that that is needed if you want to be fair for what you have to do outside, but fair because you have to make sure that everybody's represented in whatever product or response you come out with. Then in this NDC, we tackle the challenge by creating a lot of different scenarios. And for that, we wanted to create, or we wanted to use this approach of multiple universes. And this is an approach when you create different scenarios, but not different in terms of 5 or 4, but you create 1,000 different scenarios by introducing the right premises and the right elements and the right information, the right data, both data that is quantifiable and data that is qualifiable.
Ms. Villalobos, we will have to move to the other, but please.
Please, I will wrap it up. I will wrap it up then. Okay, thank you very much. And in doing so, and what I wanted to end up is, We can do that. All countries can do that. We can play with the possibilities and then just create different scenarios, different universes, and then just make sure that the long-term strategies that we have are there and can be calibrated every 5 years with the NDCs, and then just, again, aiming towards a better and a more ambitious outcome. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ms. Villalobos. I'm now turning to the representative of a small island stand, Ambassador Felson. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This has been very interesting conversation. I did prepare some notes, having some reflection on equity considerations from a small island developing state perspective, obviously. I think, looking at the literature, there's been a lot of focus on equity and the unit of analysis that's being used to determine equities is very important for purposes of international cooperation on climate change. The country is the unit of analysis, but at the same time, as we've heard in this discussion, equity and fairness are principles that are nationally applicable. I mean, Ana Patricia just mentioned that as a matter of responsibility of a state to its citizenry. So the individual unit of analysis is also very relevant. And this is even more important given the whole bottom-up approach that's espoused in the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And I think what has occurred with these different units of analysis is that there's now this tension in the equity considerations that we are talking about in the global commons with respect to the Paris Agreement, even as we want to, and we should be, also preserving individual rights. So the emergent focus I find on this concept of just transition is one way in which that tension is being addressed. But in my view, it effectively prioritizes an individual unit over the global unit of analysis, which becomes a problem because as a representative of a small island developing state, representing people who are bearing and will continue to bear the earliest climate disruptions to the entire environmental, economic, and social systems of island nations, that kind of approach could actually result in an equity adverse effect for SIDS. It could, in my view, entrench what has been called a systemic tolerance for incrementalism and asymmetric consequences when spatially and temporally, equity for SIDS, for small island developing states, demands urgent transformation and affirmative action. And I will drop in a concept that we use in the climate change process. It requires an affirmative action to address permanent loss and damage because it is occurring and it will occur. Similarly, though, global approaches that have been proposed for equity considerations would have diminutive, if any, impact in ameliorating the double asymmetry that SIDS face. So that double asymmetry is that we are the least contributor, yet the largest impacted, and with the least or most constrained capacity, but carrying the heaviest burden. I looked at one analysis that applied the different principles for equity considerations, and it basically demonstrated that the concept of the adjustment cost principle favors the status quo, whereas the equal per capita emissions, the historic responsibility, and the ability to pay approaches for equity favor some poor and populous developing countries over other developing countries, and none of them address the concerns of small island developing states. So how we look at equity then requires a much deeper understanding of dynamics going beyond just the global and local tension. It also, in my view, requires special consideration of the particular circumstances of small island developing states. And I would also propose that that loss and damage paradigm that I mentioned earlier provides a direct entry point to begin to address the particular equity considerations for small island developing states. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Felson. I have now the pleasure to turn to Mr. Winkler from South Africa.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Since time is going on, I'll be brief. There are, I think I was a little bit surprised by the discussion about, because what is important now, as Franz indicated in the beginning, I think, is fairness in NDCs, whether that's in South Africa, where I come from and do my research, or in Switzerland, and I think in an increasing number of countries, as somebody just mentioned, the issue of just transition is really at the center of this debate now. And I would say there are two parts to that just transition. Definitely the rapid reductions to net zero, but also social justice. So the questions at the beginning of discussion have tended to focus on allocating an overall budget. And there's lots of literature on this. Bolivia proposes in Paris, but it was not capable of agreement. So I think the question we really should be spending more time on is, what is a fair share for a country? And as Dr. Bachmann said, I think we can. I think he raised this point. And the issues within a country of how equity looks within a country in preparing an NDC, I think is actually quite a different discussion. We did a case study of a few NDCs and their preparation. And the most common argument that we found was not per capita emissions or any of the metrics that have been put forward, but simply that we have a small share. And I think that is really telling, because I think that is essentially a reason, so that this is equity being used as an argument for inaction in often very contested domestic discussions. And we looked at quite a range of countries about 4 case studies, but many different countries in the one case study. The second point I wanted to make was just a comment on the debate about framing this around generations. And I'm not a philosopher, but I was listening very keenly to the philosophers in this presentation. And I think it is true that we can only spend the remaining carbon budget, but I would strongly disagree that means we ignore what has been spent in the past. I don't agree with the suggestion that we somehow deal with that somewhere else. I think the future remaining carbon budget, as well as a historical carbon budget, are integrally related physically in the physical science. And I think Professor Mayer somewhat alluded to this at one point in terms of how long gases stay in the atmosphere. But they're also deeply related in policy terms. Some other speakers have framed this in a way that I think is helpful around challenges of both development and climate. So I was quite struck by the analogy that was about the parents that was made in the beginning. But I would expect in that analogy that I think Anya made, the delinquent parent to make reparations. And I think that is essential. Otherwise, I think maybe this is stretching the analogy, but what came to mind would be a family approaching the bank, wanting to talk only about future withdrawals from the budget, but not willing to talk about the big negative opening balance and who has been living beyond their means. And that brings me to my final point, the notion of grandfathering that has been raised a couple of times. I think of grandfathering simply as freezing existing inequalities in place. And I think in what Professor Mayer raised in relation to the NDCs, I think that confuses, at least in my mind, grandfathering or initial emissions as a starting point. Of course, that is where we are. But I think that's an entirely different proposition, at least in my mind, to using grandfathering as an allocation principle. Now, I don't see any ethical basis for using it as such. So the starting point is not the same as a fair allocation principle. I would say that to use this one qualifier, accounting for the benefits of past emissions is very important. Yeah, I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Winkler. We now turn to Vincente Yu.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. And yeah, I'm glad to be able to come here and also be able to comment. I've had the privilege of working with many of my colleagues from the climate negotiation side in different capacities in the climate negotiations. And I think when one discusses the issue of fairness and equity in terms of how governments craft their NDCs and show that's ambitious, I think for many of the developing countries that I have worked with, I think the key phrase that often sort of like sticks in their mind when policymakers look at how they shape their NDCs is that phrase in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement that talks about climate actions being in the context of sustainable development and eradication of poverty. And I think that is crucial because I think it was Dr. Bachman earlier today and Dr. Mayer that pointed out that these are some of the considerations that actually have to be looked into, because it talks about standard of living, about improving the quality of life for everybody, regardless of where you are from. And I think from that perspective, there are several things that perhaps need to be thrown into the mix of talking about fairness and equity from in both a subjective and an objective sense. One is that none of us have really touched on this issue of energy access and how do you create conditions in which people and communities that are energy poor are able to have access to energy which are not expensive, right? And that really calls into the mix this idea of, okay, how do you make sure that energy technologies that are clean and not emitting greenhouse gases are made available to them. Second is the idea of economic development. And I agree with what Ana Patricia was saying about, okay, maybe we need to think about a different kind of development. And for many developing countries, this might really go into this whole issue of what both Janine and Harold were talking about just transition, about moving away from a heavily carbon intensive, maybe agricultural or industrial infrastructure or economic system towards one that is not. The question of how to diversify away from that then becomes part of the equity mix. A third major, I think, issue when we talk about fairness and equity in NDCs in the context of sustainable development and eradication of poverty is what Harold was pointing out. This big elephant in the room about how do you account and bring into that mix the whole issue of climate debt, of historical emissions that have created, going to my fourth point, this greater capacity to act on the part of developed countries and much lesser capacity to act in many developing countries. And that is, I think, very much linked together. On that fourth point, on the capacity to act, there are two, I think, streams there. One is fairness and equity implies looking not only at the domestic capacity to act, which implies looking at whether your economy is feasible in your economy to achieve the 7% rate of annual emission reductions that one of the previous speakers was suggesting, but also whether your economy or your government is in fact receiving support from elsewhere, from those that have both greater capacity to act and greater capacity to provide that support, so that your country, for example, as a developing country, could then actually do more, using those kinds of externally provided resources. The fifth, sixth, and seventh points are related that I want to raise before I end. One is we also need to really look at the mitigation profile and mitigation capacity of developing countries. For example, it might not necessarily make sense from a fairness and equity point of view to ask developing countries that have very low either per capita or aggregate emissions to focus on mitigation when perhaps adaptation might actually be the greater part of what they need in terms of their national objectives. And so, you know, the fifth one there is then adaptation in terms of that link between mitigation and adaptation, where if a developing country in the context of how it crafts its NDCs feels that because it does not emit that much, or there is very little capacity in the context of its national circumstances for it to reduce much more than what it already has, then it has to go into adaptation in order to improve the ability of its economy to be more resilient long term. But as I think Janine was pointing out, there are limits to adaptation, and that will be the last point I want to raise, that part of the whole equity discussion in terms of NDCs really then have to delve deeply into the question of loss and damage, and how do you build into any kind of regime a much more robust mechanism for addressing the loss and damage that many countries are going to have as a result of the global warming that we are already locked into. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincente. Now it's my pleasure to turn to Sébastien from Ciel. Sébastien, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I will be addressing some points that have already been made by other speakers, but I think from our perspective, or from a civil society perspective, the first question is, what is the problem that we are trying to fix with this? And I guess, of course, bringing equity at the core of the international cooperation framework is important to address the critical inequalities that the climate crisis has brought upon us. The fact that the climate crisis is the result of historic context, but also we have to remember also that we are trying to close this ambition gap. And so I think what's particularly important is to also consider, at the light of the climate urgency that we are currently facing, to what extent we can use equity really as a pathway to ambition, because we just don't have a luxury to lose more time. And I think we are all very well aware of this based on the most recent IPCC reports. And equity and fairness is those are actually principles that are shared universally by people that governments are trying to serve. So a critical benefit of bringing equity at the core of this discussion is maybe to move a little bit beyond the more technical conversations and really to root climate action back into this belief that actually public servants should be serving a greater equity and fairness, and maybe considering to what extent actually fostering conversation around equity can help us actually unleash additional commitments, but also actually willingness by the people to really support more adequate, more ambitious climate policies. And so in that context, I really commend the initiative of Switzerland to convene this discussion today, also of having tried to address some equity consideration in its INDC. As far as I know, that's one of the INDC that try among developed countries to unpack them more, at least the arguments from the Swiss government's perspective. So that's a very good start, and we will only benefit from having more conversations like this. What's particularly important is also to be very transparent with the assumptions that are being made, and really not to be focused too much on certain equity dimensions that actually just contribute to further politicizing the debate, but really embracing what equity means actually, and trying to really have a very honest conversation about what equity will require different states to do in the context of the crisis that we are facing right now. The good thing is that the guidelines for NDCs are actually encouraging states to follow the example set by Switzerland and other countries to actually include information related to the fairness of their NDCs as they submit their NDCs. And so hopefully when we have the next global stocktake, and actually even before that, we can have more conversation like the one that we are having today to really unpack what equity means in different national contexts. Now, one of the challenges, and I think today's event actually reflects this a little bit, is that we still face this tension between, are we discussing equity in the context of the quantified national targets as set up in NDCs by many countries, or are we speaking about equity in the broader context of international climate policies? And NDCs sometimes tend to now become the main vehicle to commit international climate action, but to a large extent, they are very limited in terms of their scope. And In particular, when we try to discuss equity, it's easy to use or to focus on certain elements of NDCs and to lose sight of the importance of addressing other elements. And so maybe just to spend a couple of minutes unpacking this a little bit. The first thing is that we've seen different types of targets being shared by countries, and it's very important to acknowledge the importance for states to take equitable action at home to reduce emissions sufficiently rapidly to meet those science and equity-based pathways that states need to put forward if we are to meet the 1.5-degree target, but also then to consider what is the contribution that states, particularly the main polluters on a historic or a per capita basis, or also those with most capacity, their responsibility in terms of supporting climate action in third countries. And the challenge, of course, is that in some of the targets, this is a little bit mixed because you see a target for domestic emission reduction that is combined with some amount of international cooperation efforts. And so just making clear that what is the domestic effort that states are putting forward in their NDCs, and then what contributes to the broader international mitigation effort, whether through international transfer of emission reductions or through climate finance for mitigation. I think that's very important to not lose track of the fact that a domestic action is required no matter what, and must be following equitable and science-based pathways. The second thing that I would like to touch on very briefly is also the fact that now we are seeing an increasing focus on the long-term targets, the net zero target, with very little unpacking on what this means actually for the actual efforts, the actual ambition in the short term of individual countries. So I think this is something that where a lot of civil society organizations are having growing concerns. Net zero emissions are extremely vague when it comes to their contribution to equity. What does it mean in terms of where negative emissions are supposed to take place? And for some countries, like, what are the assumptions that enable you to aim at net zero emission mid-century with very slow increase of ambition in the short and mid-term? And we've seen actually increasing amount of cases, for instance, in Europe, whether in the Netherlands or most recently in France, with courts actually asking the governments to really accelerate their short-term action and not to focus only on the mid-term targets that are very aspirational, but fail to indicate actually how much of the carbon budget is going to be consumed by those pathways with a delayed start in terms of emission reduction and then an increasing acceleration of reductions. Another dimension is the fact that climate action requires whole of society climate policies, and NDCs for a majority of countries tend to focus a lot on specific territorial emissions, but they fail to consider also the way that actually countries contribute to the climate crisis through a much broader range of responsibility. We've been hearing some discussion today about the importance of considering equity dimension at the national level, the individual responsibility element there. And so one thing that NDCs failed to do so far is to consider gray emissions associated with international transport. And so that's very important when we foster equity-based discussion to keep this in mind, the fact that actually if we focus on national emissions based on the national targets, we fail to consider actually the contribution of lifestyle to the climate crisis. And so this is something that also should be considered for some of the developed countries in particular, or some of the industrialized countries. There is a tremendous impact once you start to take those elements into consideration. We've been hearing several references to a just transition and the importance for us to change our development model. So another element there is also how individual countries contribute to undermining the carbon budget or consuming the carbon budget, not just through territorial emissions, but through their investments in carbon-intensive industry, through their exports of energy, without taking any consideration of equity into these particular policies. And finally, in relation to the scope of NDCs and the importance to try to broaden our understanding of what national contributions should be to international climate actions, there's been several references to the importance of loss and damage. And I think there is a broad saying that highlights that actually ignoring loss and damage in climate policy is a privilege that the least impacted or those with most resources actually have at their disposal. But for the countries at the front line, that's something that is actually defines their relation to climate change. And so understanding actually equity and how equity is supposed to inform national climate action, not just from the perspective of mitigation, but also on how we globally share the burden related to loss and damage, not just within the well-established UNFCCC framework that is particularly weak on loss and damage, but also finding other ways to really support through equity-based approaches the challenges of countries at the front line. There were several discussion on indicators. I will put a link in the responses, not to go too deep there, but there is a great framework that civil society experts have put forward that I will really encourage people to review. It's the Civil Society Equity Review. And I just wanted to conclude, because we don't have so much time today, but I hope it's just the beginning of a rebirth of this conversation around equity and the UN framework cooperation on climate change. It's the importance of equity really to inform climate responses, to contribute to themes like just transition, climate justice, and actually also to uphold what one of the participants has highlighted in the chat, the existing legal obligation actually of all states to cooperate globally for the global realization of human rights, and the importance to bring back this historic understanding of what actually states are compelled to do under international law to make sure that we can actually not further undermine climate justice or the universal understanding of what human rights are, but really contributing towards them with greater ambition that is science-based and informed by equity.
Thank you, Sébastien. I'm now turning to France to take a decision. We are over time, and some participants have started leaving the event because in this world we are all running from a meeting to another. Franz, what should we do with the questions? Should we try to pick up a few, or should we answer the questions in the webpage of the event?
I would suggest certainly to try to pick up a few and then also give most importantly space, at least that we hear the questions, and then give space on the webpage to answer the question. I think that would make the most practical way forward.
Thank you, Franz. So before giving you the floor, I'm turning to Malou to just summarize a few questions that were raised, the most important. Malou, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi. So I have a question from Kankana Das from India for Professor Xu. Is it good enough to just focus on zeroing of carbon dioxide? What about the methane emission, which is huge in countries such as India, mainly from landfill sites? There's also another question from Simone Sisolo. Reducing emissions is a collective action problem. The presence of free riding means that some countries do not take on their fair share of emissions reduction. Is the compliance mechanism under the Paris Agreement enough? And what do you envision to promote compliance further? And finally, we have a comment from Ziaul Hauke, who said that it is very difficult to agree on individual burden sharing of numbers and carbon budget. We should resort to both mandatory and voluntary provisions set out in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement and putting emphasis on achieving sustainable development goals, targets, and indicators. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Malou. Franz, should we give the floor to some of our panelists, or should we?
I would say let's try to do it, but really try to be very short, and then but also highlight that additional questions perhaps will come in later on the webpage, and then invite all the panelists, those who are speaking, and the commentators also perhaps also to try to respond to this question in writing a little bit more detailed afterwards.
So let me start by Professor Xu. Professor Xu, the floor is yours. I haven't muted you.
I didn't get the contrast in the question. I was asked, was it enough to focus on reaching net zero carbon, and what about something else? But I couldn't hear the something else.
So the question that was specifically addressed to you was, is it good enough to just focus in zeroing of CO2? What about the methane emission, which is huge in countries like India, mainly from landfill sites?
I'm sorry, I still didn't get, what about the what? What
about the methane emission? Methane.
Oh.
Yes, methane, sorry.
Oh, absolutely. we were told to restrict ourselves to 15 minutes. So there are all sorts of things I didn't talk about, including issues of international equity. I simply tried to make one point about intergenerational, but yes, methane is very important, and the fact that it's short-lived shouldn't make us think it doesn't matter, because it could push us over a threshold for one of the tipping points that I was talking about. I think the key thing about methane is there's been all this talk about using gas as a so-called bridge. You know, everybody agrees coal is worst. People say, well, let's move to gas as our bridge toward renewables, because gas is better than coal. But what we're discovering is the amount of methane that's released in the drilling for gas and the transmission of gas and the flaring of gas is much greater than we knew. And so, yes, we should worry about methane. And one thing we should do, I think, is not think that gas is a good intermediate measure. We need to eliminate all fossil fuels, including gas, as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Professor Shu. Professor Carnine, anything you would like to add in relation to the questions that were in the chat? I'm unmuting you, please.
Oh, okay. Yes, no. I mean, I basically agree. They were. I mean, most of the questions are of a practical one that I could respond to. Are the compliance condition on the Paris Agreement, are they enough to ensure that people comply? So, you know, it's an important practical question to actually get people to comply and get others to comply. That's difficult for me to answer. I can only say what I said before, namely, of course, you know, the actions of compliers shouldn't be dictated by what the non-compliers fail to do. And then maybe as much as people move ahead, the more people comply and the more people are good moral citizens, that will maybe do enough to shame others into compliance.
Thank you. Professor Meyer? Yeah, thank you. Professor Meyer, now turning to you, and I can unmute you, please.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe also a remark on this issue of compliance and why fairness considerations, as we discussed them, are important. So one question that actors, relevant agents, whether they are individuals or whether they are states, can ask themselves is, well, what if all others would comply? Is my fair share? And that was the kind of question that, of course, I was pursuing in my proposal. So I didn't discuss non-compliance issues. I was assuming that all would comply, and then asked what the fair shares would be. Now, even in a bottom-up approach, so even when you assume that a fair solution cannot be imposed effectively by a political institution, that question, I think, is important because it gives the agents normative considerations as to assess what they should at least do in terms of contributing to solving the problem, disregarding the additional problems that arise from the non-compliance of others. So I think when we discuss this, we should follow what many have done, namely distinguish these cases, the cases for full compliance and partial compliance, and ask the fairness questions for both cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Meyer. Andreas, anything you would add? I'm unmuting you, please.
Yes, thanks. No, not really. Anja Kanan has mentioned, I guess, the point that is also important for me. I think from a philosophical standpoint, you could argue that her example with the parents. I mean, you can generalize this example and say, yes, you can interpret the harm principle in such a way that, that there is a duty to compensate for those who do not do what they're supposed to do. No, even though you may not have caused the harm, you have to try to avoid the damage if you can, especially in this case when the damage could be very, very, very huge. This may be unfair, but if there's a conflict between fairness and do things that you have to do in order to avoid a huge damage, and you're able to do that, well, in this case, the harm principle, in my opinion, says, well, yes, you have a moral duty to do things that are unfair. But how that would be, I mean, that's just a statement now. Of course, philosophically speaking, you would have to try to justify why this is the case, actually. But I think, and the example of Anya was just a good intuitive example to illustrate this general point. But I think you could justify this argument.
Thank you, Andreas. I'm now turning up to Ambassador Franz Perez for the closure of this event. A lot of things have been said. It's going to be very complicated to summarize, but Franz, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and I think we need another hour to summarize what all has been said. I think it was really a very interesting discussion, and I personally have learned again a lot of things, and I think already therefore I'm really grateful. It brought together the academic and theoretical perspective in the first part. We then also the perspective from those who have been directly engaged in the negotiations. At the beginning, I think Henry Schuh and Anya Kain were just indicating that that the intergenerational equity really requires each of us to do the maximum possible, and that more than fairness within today's generation is really not to put an undue burden to the future. So that the argument that Anna Kain was referring to in the Swiss first ICTU on the NDC, that because we are doing our fair share, we are not supposed to do more than what we can do. That's not a good argument in view of this intergenerational perspective. I thought that was quite a nice first introduction. So that we have to do the maximum possible. Then the second cluster presentation was discussing models for a top-down allocation of the carbon budget by Lukas Meyer, and then Andreas Bachmann was commenting on that, challenging some of the elements presented by Lukas Meyer, adding some other elements. What I thought interesting is that while the second approach just tried to determine from an objective perspective, top-down, what should be done by each country, the first cluster just tried to argue that equity requires to us to do the most maximum possible. And that's a different approach, so either to receive a top-down allocation of a budget or to do the maximum possible. And then in the discussion, I think these different models, the contraction and conveyance, or the equal per capita model, for example, was fundamentally challenged, I think, by Janine Felsen, indicating that both these approaches do not work from a small islands development country perspective. Question about grandfathering, and I like the point how Harold did put it, that grandfathering always seems to imply a freezing of existing inequalities. Vincente then highlighted that equity also has a notion of just transition. I think Janine was also referring to it, and Anna also, and that fairness and equity consideration also have a dimension of capacity building and support, something that was missed perhaps in the first round of discussions. And Janine was highlighting that equity and fairness can not be considered without also looking at loss and damage. Sebastian then quite nicely indicating that it is equity and fairness should be a tool for countries to develop ambitious NDCs, and that it should be a call to do more at the domestic level, and perhaps also looking at grey emissions And in this context, I cannot resist to draw your attention to the IC2, the Information on Criteria, Transparency and Understanding of our NDC, of Switzerland's NDC, that will be submitted this week. We will include a component in there addressing also grey emissions. Harald then was also arguing in the same manner that equity has to be a tool that helps us in the countries in doing the maximums internally, and that equity should never be an argument for inaction, arguing that my share is so small so I don't have to do more. And all this built it up a little bit to what Anna said in her first intervention, the first comment, that Paris, that is not taking a top-down approach. It's taking a bottom-up approach. It's looking at processes. And that's where fairness has become so important, and where the fairness consideration becomes so important. She was highlighting that there are greater responsibilities by developed countries, that there are greater opportunities perhaps for emission reductions by developing countries. But what is important, that everybody tries to do the maximum, that is fairness considerations in that process of developing NDCs should be a tool really to bring us to maximize what we can do. It should trigger us to do more. And I think that is, for me, the most important thing. It's not so important whether we agree on one of the concepts of allocation, of a fair allocation of a carbon budget. Each of these concepts could be criticized, but there are many concepts, many models who seem to indicate how much we should do, and probably each of them shows that we should do more. And the benefit of being obliged as a country not only to look at fairness and equity consideration when developing our NDC, but also to report about our consideration in the information on criteria, transparency and understanding of our NDC, so that we have to share with everybody how we considered equity and fairness when we were developing our NDC, and how we think that what we're doing is fair and equitable. That is certainly, or should be certainly, a strong push factor motivating us, pushing us really to do more, because we expose our arguments, and exposing arguments, that's not in order to be then shamed and blamed, but in order to get feedbacks like the one today from Anne Karenina, that perhaps one of our reflections was not good enough and that we have to go back and do more. I think coming back and doing more, that's not only for each of the countries when looking at the NDCs, that's also for us together here when we are reflecting about equity considerations in the context of NDCs. And I think this is a discussion that has to continue, not because I believe that we will find the truth, how the carbon budget can be allocated in a fair and equitable manner, but because this discussion will again and again and again show us that we are not doing enough, and that we can do more, and that we have to do more. So thank you very much for these really interesting presentations, and I'm looking forward to interact with many of you again in soon, and I wish you all a nice day, and hand back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Franz, Ambassador Perez. This was perfect. We will try to summarize, we will summarize what was presented at this event, and that will be available on the webpage of the event. Those who were with us on WebEx, you will soon receive a message with the link to that webpage. For who is following us on Facebook, the link will be shared in a comment. I want to thank those who stayed with us until the end. We want also, of course, to thank the panelists and the commentators that joined us for the discussion today, but also that stayed more than half an hour longer than what it was expected. So thank you very much for all. I think it was a very interesting, also interesting comments. And we will continue the discussion on the webpage of the event by answering the questions that remain answered. Later this week, we have the Ambition Summit convened by the UN with a series of countries. And for what concerns the GEN, we will be active also later this week discussing plastics, and next week discussing the preparations for the UN Environmental Assembly. So I hope to see some of you online again with us on Thursday or next week. it's now time to conclude the event and to say goodbye to all of you. Thank you. Bye.